Here in Australia, it's springtime and the honey is really coming in, so it's kind of honey month for us here too. And you can see the beautiful colours in here coming in, different flavours from different flowers, and the bees are really going about their work. And here's your typical filling pattern where they're filling all the cells with the nectar, dehydrating it, doing their amazing work, creating their honey. And if we have a look in the side windows, we should see some good activity too. Now what's in there, we can see them just capping off. Give us a thumbs up if you can see the bees, the way they're putting their capping right on top of the cells, and that's their lid on the preserving jar to say, hey, the moisture content is low enough, it's going to keep on the shelf, and that way if the moisture content is low enough, will keep for a long time. So the bees know when the water content is low enough and they put their capping over the top. So when you're seeing their capping here, it's a great indication it's time to start harvesting some honey, making some space in the hive. In springtime, it's important to make some space in the hive so they don't end up with too much honey down below, because the queen needs to lay her eggs down here, and if it's all full of honey, then there's nowhere to lay her eggs, and she might swarm. This side's looking amazing too. They're just closing in the caps. Give us a thumbs up if you can see the bees there right on their hexagon cells that they've drawn out from our flow frame invention, and the capping just going on in these regions. So today we have a Q&A. Put your questions in the comments below. We'll get to answering those. Trace will read them out and we'll do our best to answer. Now let's harvest a bit of honey, because we do need to make some space here, and if you look after the bees, they really do look after us. And this cap's been left off. That's interesting. We'll sort that out later. We'll choose this one to harvest. And these caps have been left off too. When you leave the caps off, then you'll get bees or ants or things crawling in here, and it may need a clean out before you can harvest. Here we go. I'm going to harvest this frame right here, and it looks like a really light honey today, and all I'm going to do is put this tube in the bottom, take this little cap out of the top, and then using our flow key, I will just turn it like this, and straight away you'll see this honey starting to flow. Now it's warm in the hive, pretty easy to turn the key today. Sometimes you need to do it in segments because it's quite hard to turn the key. Beautiful, this honey is coming out a very light colour, which is amazing. Very light. And it looks like we might be having some technical difficulties. Hang in there or jump across to one of our other channels if you need to hear the audio. Now, look at this. Can't wait to taste this flavour. We've got a lot of things flowering here in spring, a lot of understory down here in the rainforest flowering, and it produces this really light coloured honey in the springtime. And in the wintertime, you get the darker honeys here. So we get a good cross section of these colours, but look at that, that's amazing. Wow, that's yum. I recognise that flower because I can see it flowering just over here, and that is the privet. Produces a lot of white flowers and produces a really good flow in the springtime. Yum, yum. So you get all of these different flavours coming in throughout the year, and one thing when we were inventing the flow hive, one thing we didn't realise was isolating the flavours would really become an important and exciting thing for beekeepers, because when you harvest this honey from one frame and this light colour from the next frame, you get to taste the differences in the flavours, and that is a really exciting thing, because it's almost like keeping the flavours separate in your kitchen or mixing them all together. You can still get a good result mixing them all together, but it's really nice to be able to taste them separately and bring that story of the honey to the table. Okay. Now, having technical problems, are we rolling on some channels still? Okay,
Yeah,
good. We'll
Facebook
keep
videos
going.
are all good and TikTok's all sweet.
Okay, excellent. So we've been harvesting away all of these different flavours here, and have a look at the different colours. While you're thinking of your questions, I'll start putting some of them up here so you can get a really good look at the different colours through the, with the sun coming through them like that. Look at the differences. It's just incredible. And there's as many different flavours of and colours of honey as there are flowers producing nectar. And it's just wonderful to be able to harvest them single frame honeys, they're single jars, and I really recommend doing that. Some people mix it all in a bucket, but imagine mixing all of those flavours together in a bucket. Once you realise you can isolate them single frame to single jar, you really don't want to go back, because the enjoyment of tasting each one is a beautiful thing. Now let's see, there's a lot of heavy honey here. Hopefully this little plank will hold them up. There we go. Look at that, with the sun shining through. You can really see the different colours, and this next one that's coming in is a much lighter colour, which is exciting. We don't get much of this really light colour. It just comes in the spring, and then it changes back to these deep red and auburn tones. Are there any questions coming in?
Yes, Seeds, on YouTube actually, Jamie's wondering how often do you clean under the flow frames, like in the channel where the honey flows out?
Okay, to be honest, I don't clean there very much at all, but perhaps I should sometimes. If you've left the cap off or something like that, like one of these had, you can get bees crawling in there, you can get ants crawling in there, and sometimes you just need to clean that out. Now there's a few different ways to do that. Obviously you take the cap out, but getting the key and putting a wet dishcloth on it, nice thin one, you can wrap that around, you can just give it a good wipe out if there is a bit of debris building up in there, or if you've got some honey that's been sitting in there a while and gone fermented or anything like that. But mostly you don't really have to do much, and you've got to watch things like this. See this one here? You can see a bit of honey built up in there. Now if it hasn't been there long, you can just give that back to the bees. Sometimes just turning this cap around is all you need to do, and it breaks the little seal down there. But if they've really blocked up that little, what we call the leak back point, then you just get something like this, put it in there, and now you've broken that little seal, and any honey that builds up in there will drain back into the hive for the bees to reuse. Any questions coming in?
Yes, Seeds. So with all the different colours, are you able to tell which, I guess, what flowers that honey's been collected from?
Yes, some but not all. So there's so many different flavours that come in this area, it's impossible to know them all, but some are very distinctive. So one of the distinctive ones we get here is the paperbark, which flowers down here in the valley. The indigenous here call it the rain tree, and it responds to the rain, bursts into bloom, and you get this great blossom that produces almost sickly sweet, kind of slightly caramelized toffee flavour. And that's a really distinctive one because you can smell the flowers and you can taste the honey and really link the two. And that's a really nice way to be able to tell what honey it is. You've also got the Goya here, which is a very floral, very strong scent in the flower, and you can really pick up that in the honey as well in the springtime. It's just about the flower, which is exciting because that one just blows your taste buds right off. It's so strong. Some people love it, some people hate it, but I like it because it's just so different to the others. And then you've got the macadamia, which is a bit of a neutral flavour. We get a lot of that here in the springtime too. And this one here I can tell is the privet honey, which is just in bloom at the moment, and this has filled up very quickly, this hive. In the last month this has gone from nothing to full, And so then you can take a guess at what's been flowering, have a look around, taste the honey, smell the flowers, and then you can really start linking the honey flavours with the things that flower around, which is a wonderful thing to do.
Great. See, to Cherise in Utah, I'm just wondering, when is the best time to establish a beehive?
So it really does depend on your local climate. So ask your local beekeepers what's the best time to get going. And it really does also depend on what way you're starting. If you're purchasing a full going hive off somebody, perhaps you're purchasing a conventional Langstroth hive and you're doing a swap out into a flow hive, you can do that through all of the warmer months of the year, even in the that's if you're in a colder region. If you're where we are in the subtropics, you can start a hive just about any time of year, because even in the winter we get good honey flows. But unanimously, springtime is all around the globe the time where the bees are the busiest with a lot of resources, so that is a great time to get going, but it doesn't mean you can't start at other times of year as well. Often it's when you can get bees or take a split from somebody else will dictate when you can get going. But it's really important to get your equipment, get it all prepped. If you're using our Ocari like this, then put your paint on it. You can get carried away with your artwork here with the family. This is a beautiful hive that Bella's painted. And once you've got it all ready, then order your bees from your local beekeepers. Starting with a nucleus is probably the easiest way to go, because they you can put it in position, wait till you're ready on the next nice warm sunny day. Get in your bee suit, wear your gloves. If you're new to beekeeping, make sure you're protecting yourself. Get out your smoker, transfer them to your bottom box, look after them, and they'll grow. And when they're ready for the top box, you can then add that. But as said, local knowledge is key. Ask your local beekeepers if it's a good time to start your hive.
Great, Cesar. I might just do a shout out here. I think we're having a few problems on Insta. I think it's the internet, or who knows, maybe it's honey month, I don't know, something's going on. But if you could just jump onto either Facebook, YouTube or TikTok, and we'll get it sorted. And we do record these, so sorry guys, but we're getting it sorted.
Keep those questions coming in. Trace will read them out, and we might pick another frame to harvest here. Let's see. We can probably slot in and harvest this one just here. I'll move that one over a little and harvest this one here because we can, and it's a good idea to start taking off some of the honey, making space in the brood box, and of course, if you look after your bees, having this beautiful product we call honey to share is just an amazing thing. Okay, so I'll turn this key again. Okay, it's pretty easy to turn today, all in one movement. Often it's a bit firm. You might need to do it in segments just to make it easier, but there we go. It's nice and warm today. The honey's flowing, and look at that, this beautiful light coloured privet honey today.
It's once you've established your super box, how long does it take before you can harvest the honey?
So that's a great question, and the answer, like most things in beekeeping, really depends, and it depends on the availability of forage and your local seasonality. So if you're in an area like this, that we're in a subtropical region where the bees can forage all year round, then you're just waiting for there to be a good honey flow in order for the bees to fill the super. This box has been on a month. We're in our springtime now, so it's gone from 0 to full in that time. But other times of year, you might be waiting a long time. Perhaps the bees are a bit hungry and they're actually retracting honey. So a bit of patience is key as well in order to get your honey. But when you see that the honey's really coming in, go ahead and harvest frames as soon as you see them full, and that way you'll be making space in the hive, which will be good for the bees as well. It will limit them getting overcrowded in the brood box, and you get to store honey in jars on the shelf, and when it's really on, it's on. Like we'll see these 2 frames will probably fill up perhaps in days, and then we can harvest them again.
And this is a good one. How much honey, if you're taking it out, how do you know how much to leave for the bees?
Okay, that is a really climate specific question as well. So ask your local beekeepers how much honey you need to leave for the bees for them to survive potentially a long, cold winter ahead. We don't have a long, cold winter as far as the European honeybee is concerned, so we can go ahead and harvest whenever we see the frames are full. In other parts of the world, you do need to be careful. Make sure you're leaving enough honey for the bees and there is enough stores for them to survive. After all, it is their carbohydrate, it is their food, and if they don't have enough stores, beekeepers will feed them sugar syrup to build up some stores to last a long winter ahead. As to how much you need to leave, that will be best to come from your local beekeepers. So if you've got a long snowy winter, you might need to leave a full box of honey for them, or you might need to leave half a box of honey for them, or in extreme cases it might be more than a box of honey you need for your bees to survive through till the next spring.
Great. Now Brian's just installed his nuke into his brood box and to his new flow hive this morning, but his beekeepers insisted that they use frames with foundation and knows that we use foundationless frames. Just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, I covered the pros and cons of foundationless frames in last week's live, so if you go back and have a look at that, it will be educational on the topic, but just to cover it basically, I used foundation for a very long time. Nothing wrong with it really, it's just that we don't need to use it with the flow hives. We don't need the support of foundation, be it wax and wire or plastic. We can let the bees draw it perfectly natural for themselves in the bottom box here, because we're not going to ever put those frames into a centrifuge because we have a new way of harvesting with our flow frame invention. So you can go ahead and try out and see what works for you. You can mix it up and put some foundation sheets if you want, but the pros and cons basically are a little bit more work in the hive when you are going foundationless, because the frames might be a little bit more wobbly and you might need to correct them and get them going on the comb guide. But a lot less work in the shed, and there's a lot of hidden benefits, like these frames can just stay with this hive. We don't need to take them back to the shed for reprocessing like you do when you have foundation. So you don't have a whole lot of equipment in the shed sitting there getting wax moths on them and so on. It basically can stay with the hive. You can pull out a foundationless frame, easily cut out its contents if you want to cycle out old comb and put that frame straight back in the middle, which is a great thing to do in the springtime to alleviate the overcrowded or nowhere for the queen to lay. So if you give some fresh real estate there, they can build some comb and the queen can lay eggs, then it will limit that primary swarming trigger. Harvesting honey is another thing you should be doing as well in the springtime if your frames are filling up.
Great, and just on for that question as well for Brian, the beekeeper also said to don't touch them for a month, and wondering if that's different to sort of what we say.
Don't touch them for a month?
Don't touch them for a month, yeah.
In regards to?
The brood frames, once he's installed his nuke.
Okay, once you've installed your nuke, if you're going foundationless, get in there before a month, check that they are going straight. The one time I wouldn't inspect is if I've put a new queen in. So let's say you've requeened a hive, you want to wait a week at least before you open it up, or you might increase the chances of the bees balling the new queen you've put in. So, but otherwise I can't see a reason, unless it's really cold and windy or rainy, to go ahead and inspect your hive and enjoy watching them grow as they build in the foundationless frames. And you also have the opportunity to straighten them up if they start going wonky.
Great. Now Wintry Tide Photography is just saying it loves the flow hive and can't wait to get started on the beekeeping adventure. And I might just shout out, just at the moment we have a great special on the Flow Hive 2 Plus It comes with the free hive stand, that's the screw and legs with the ant caps. So could be a good time if you're after the Flowhive 2 Plus, which is the Western Red Cedar one. I think Ben's zooming in on that stand now for you.
It's a useful stand because you can adjust it on each corner there. If you're in a soft garden soil like this, do put a paver or something underneath it just to make sure it doesn't sink when the hive gets really heavy with honey. But being able to adjust each corner will help you with both naturally drawn comb, because you can set your level in the sideways direction with this level bubble we've put in the back here. And also there's another one in the side to get your honey harvesting angle. We did notice in the beginning that people were messing up that leveling of the hive, both for harvesting and for naturally drawn comb. So we put those levels there, gave adjustability on the corners, so it's a really handy base. You've also got the tray down at the bottom, which is useful for catching things like beetles, or perhaps an area where you can do varroa mite counts on a sticky board, things like that. A good pest management tray down the bottom underneath the screen bottom board.
Right. Matt wants to know, Seed, what's your advice to take the step of not wearing gloves?
Okay, so know your first aid. I'm not an expert in that. Be careful around bee stings. Some people do have serious allergic reactions to them. You need to know what it's like for you, and make sure you're okay before you take your gloves off. When you start out, wear your gloves, get used to your hive's temperament, get used to what they sound like when they're getting more agitated, and that's a good time to put your gloves on. Small steps with this, because you don't want to give yourself an experience where you get a whole lot of stings. So I'm okay with stings, and I know that. I've been beekeeping a long time. I'm happy to go gloveless, and every now and then I put my finger on a bee and get a sting. And I would prefer to get the odd sting and go gloveless, because it's just a bit easier to work in the hive. But when you start out, wear your gloves and just slowly progress to that as you become an experienced beekeeper.
Great. Cedar, KJ's heading into a freezing cold winter where they live, and just wondering, should they wait till spring to start beekeeping?
Ooh. It's hard to get started in the winter time, so you may need to be waiting to spring. However, getting your equipment, getting it prepared is a good idea, so you're ready to go when somebody has a colony for you, whether you can order a nucleus off a beekeeper, or take a split from a friend, or catch a swarm, or there's also packages you can order in the mail of bees in some countries. So there's a few different ways to get started, but getting your equipment is one of the first steps on your journey. You don't want it the other way around, where you get your bees but you don't have your box to put it in. So I'd really recommend to be prepared, excuse the pun, and get your equipment ready, so that when the season's right and when the bees are available, you can put them in and get going.
Great. Jamie, you're asking about spare parts for the basin stand. Yep, call customer support if you need things like that, and the crew there will help you out. Cedar, do the bees get harmed when you're harvesting honey?
So we put a lot of effort into that, and that was a big part of the inspiration. Is I was harvesting conventionally, which involves, if you've done this, you know how it goes. You know, perhaps if you've got one small colony, you can pull it apart gently and take the honey and put it back in a really gentle way. When you've got a lot of hives and they're really busy with bees, you actually end up creating quite a bit of disturbance when you pull the honey boxes. You're taking out the conventional frames, you're brushing the bees off, or perhaps you're using a leaf blower, and you're taking those honey frames to a processing shed, and the whole way you do end up with a lot of disturbance to the hive, a lot of squash bees. It's pretty hard to avoid. So that was a big piece of inspiration. It's like, can't we just tap the honey straight out of the hive while the bees are going about their business? And we put a decade of work into it and learnt a lot along the way. And if you look in the window here, you can see the bees are just doing their thing. They've hardly noticed that we're harvesting honey out the back. Now, harvesting a couple of frames, the bees will hardly notice. If you go and harvest them all at once, you can notice the bees do get a little more disturbed because they've got to suddenly repair a whole lot of comb. A lot of bees have got to get out of the way to create ventilation, to control the humidity when you suddenly harvest all the frames. So I do recommend just harvesting a couple of frames at a time, and that's the minimal disturbance for the bees. If they're all capped like this, you'll find that the bees are just standing on the comb surface and they've noticed the honey's drained out from beneath their feet. If there's areas of the comb that aren't capped and there's bees down the cells, what we did about that was we made space between the moving parts. So if you imagine the parts moving like this, if we had them connecting together, then if bees are in the cells, it could go like this and come back and catch a leg or a wing. So we put these gaps here for the bees' knees so that if they are down the cells and it moves and comes back, it's not part on part like that. There's a wax bridge that joins. And what you'll find is then if they are down the cells, if they don't get out straight away, the other bees will chew up any wax that is holding them down the cell. And that way your bees can get out of any cells if they do happen to be down there, and you've got minimal disturbance to your hive. And I can confidently say I harm a lot less bees than I used to harvesting conventionally.
Right. So once once the bees deposit the honey in the flow frames before it's capped, what stops the honey from just running out?
So the bees wax, so the bees put wax all around the flow frame parts. So even though they don't connect together like this, they're going to join the wax bridge across here. They're going to coat the whole thing in wax, so the honey's sitting in a wax pocket, and that's what stops the honey from flowing down. However, some bees don't do a great job, and we had an example here earlier where there was a little bit of honey build up down the bottom. You can get some honey seeping into that trough area, and that's why we put that little leak back point, which you can see in here, that little gap that allows honey to drain back to the bees. So that otherwise it could build up there and get fermented. Bees being bees will block it up from time to time, and you'll need to unblock that. So it looks like we've made an error in manufacturing, but it's actually on purpose. It's a little gap there between the yellow part and the clear part to allow any honey that might drip through, whether it be after harvesting or another time, to go back to the bees. And we'll put little ridges here so that this can never completely close, and the bees' tongues will come up and lick into that area. It's a fun thing to get out the macro and have a look at their tongues as they will lick the remaining honey from in that trough area.
Right.
Keep the questions coming in, great questions today.
Yeah. So it's tips for harvesting or preparing for winter your flow hive in the Northern Hemisphere.
Preparing for winter in the Northern Hemisphere. So opposite to here, you're now in your fall, and it is time to make sure your bees have enough honey. Now, I'm not an expert in those colder regions, so ask local advice on how much honey you'll need to leave them. And if they don't have enough, make sure you're feeding them up so they have stores to last a long winter ahead. So that's the main thing you'll be doing. You'll sometimes be reducing the size of your hive to make it easier for them to keep it warm over the winter, but making sure they have enough stores is the main thing. If you do decide in the more temperate zones to leave the excluder in and the flow hive box on, then take the excluder out, because that way if the bees need to move up in their bee ball and consume honey from any upper boxes, then the queen can travel with the ball of bees. Otherwise she might be left behind and perish underneath the excluder, and then you'll start the spring with no queen. So that's a tip, taking out the excluder. Often beekeepers are reducing the size of their hive for a winter and making sure they have enough honey stores to survive and feed them if they don't. But ask your local advice there for those colder regions.
Great. Cedar, we've just got a couple of people who've just joined us, and you mentioned it at the start, but why is some of the honey different colours? Maybe you could just talk about that again.
So honey month in the Northern Hemisphere, and it's kind of honey month here for us in Australia too. This is when it really comes in. It's just pouring into the hives, And so if you're harvesting honey that's coming over the winter here in this region, you've got these beautiful honey flavours, like these darker tones here from the Banksias in the heathland, which are an incredible, sometimes it gets so black you cannot even see through it at all. So that's just showing the diversity, and I wanted to show you just all the different colours that come in. And today we've got an even lighter one coming in to our jar just here as well. So it's really the flowers they forage on will depict the colour, and that comes from the nectar. Some produce an incredibly dark honey, some are very light honey like this, and the range is from almost clear through to black, the reds, browns, golds, everything in between. You don't usually get blues and greens unless you live near an M&M factory, which has happened in the world apparently. It's been foraging on the colours that have been tossed out the back of the factory and tainted the colour of the honey.
Great. And Zita, do you need to filter the honey?
So I don't. Let's have a look at this. This is straight out of the hive, and if you've come from conventional harvesting, you're always filtering the honey, settling it often multiple times in order to get to a nice clean product like this. Here it is, flowing directly out of the hive. You can see a lot of bubbles in there, but you're not seeing a lot of debris. Actually, I can see one little piece of pollen, which is interesting. They don't often put pollen in the flow frames, but there one is there. So any debris will float to the top. It's unusual to get much. Sometimes it'll be a little fleck of wax or a little bit of pollen, but if this trough area is clean and the honey comes out clean, it's a major, I guess, advantage. Harvesting in this way, you get a very clean product very easily. Often people just harvest straight from their hive and they'll win the prize at the show for the clarity of their honey. And there's others entering and they've put a lot of effort into trying to get the honey to that really beautiful, clear, with a lot of clarity in it. And someone with a flow hive just fills up a jar and takes it in and wins. So I almost feel bad for those that are putting so much effort into filtering, and then you can harvest like this so easily. It's yeah, a beautiful thing. Now you could put a sieve obviously above the jar if you wanted to sieve out the odd bit of pollen or anything like that, but generally it floats to the top and you can skim it off later.
Great. So is there any advice on how or where you connect to local experts or beekeepers?
Okay, there's usually in most areas there's beekeepers, so you jump online, jump on Facebook and connect with your local beekeepers. There's clubs as well. Bearing in mind you also get a very polarized audience, so when you do start beekeeping, it's nice to be in a supportive environment where you can ask any questions, and that's what we try to create here. Ask away any questions you like and we'll do our best to answer them. So brace yourself a little bit for experienced beekeepers to not necessarily agree with the way that you want to harvest your honey. And that is a common experience because, I mean, I understand it. You've got a lot of experience built up over a long time, and then people come along with a new fandangled invention. It's actually not very new now. We're 9.5 years in. We've had it in the world, but even so, new things can often attract skepticism. So just prepare yourself for that if you're connecting with your local bee clubs. Some clubs very supportive, other clubs not so much. Not sure why, but that's the way it is.
Yeah, and maybe I can also do a shout out because we have an ambassador program as well with links on our website to different ambassadors all around the world that are often good people to link in, bee clubs. There's a map actually on our website. So check that out. If you can't find it, just contact customer support. So that's a cool thing to look at.
And
so,
if you enjoy video tuition, have a look at thebeekeeper.org. It's an initiative we put together with experts from all over the world contributing, And the idea is it's made to take you from square one, knowing nothing about bees, all the way through to even a deep scientific knowledge of honey and bees and beekeeping. And it gets rave reviews. It's an ongoing course that it can take you on a 2-year journey with lots of great training content. It's free to try, and it's also a great fundraiser. We love raising funds for bees, and in this case we support a lot of projects that are helping the bees. We've planted more than 1.5 million trees now to create billions of blossoms for the bees to safely forage on, and that's part of our mission, is to help the bees. So we're funding educational things, we're funding habitat, and we're funding things like bee-friendly farming to help farmers farm in ways that are more bee-friendly, and so on. So we've got a whole wall in the room, in our tea room, dedicated to a lot of projects we have supported, and yeah, it's one of the things that really keeps us going. So if you really want online learning, then have a look at thebeekeeper.org. It's a great online training platform for you.
Great, and I've got to shout this one out, Cedar. Jock's just said that the Flow Hive won first last year at a weekend show. I'm not sure where the show was, so go you, Jock.
Fantastic, fantastic. Yes, it's a common thing we hear is people winning the honey prize. We actually get a lot of people saying the honey has more floral notes, more flavour, and a Queensland University study actually did a blind taste testing of different methods of harvesting, and Flow Hive came up with more floral notes and more flavour essentially. So I think it's because there's zero processing here. It hasn't been spun through the air from the frame. There's no hot knife cutting off the capping. There's no, it doesn't have that same level of aeration when all those fine strands spin in the centrifuge. The contact with usually what's a stainless steel extractor can also impart flavour, and then mixing all the flavours together also changes the flavour as well. So you will get an amazing flavour harvesting in this way, and I really recommend single frames to single jars, because even though these honeys look similar, they'll be slightly different in flavour. Yum, that is a good honey. I'm actually going to have to turn this one off because this jar is full. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful? Sometimes they will overflow a 2-litre jar, and that's just over 2 litres now. And I am going to just put the key in the top. Obviously you can't turn it off too soon, or that you'll send a lot of honey back into the hive, and you don't want too much of that. So it's slowing down to a dribble now. I'm just going to put this key in, turn it to a 90 like that. Good tip is to leave it there for a minute if you can, and that just makes sure all the parts push down into position, and that'll save problems downstream. Now look at that. Yum, yum, yum. I'm just going to do the hot swap for the cap, and really that's about as much mess as you need to clean up is the honey in this tube. So that's a real win when you compare that to conventional harvesting, where you've got buckets and tubs and benches and sieves and all of that to clean up. Yum.
Does it, see, this is a good question. With these two honeys, obviously one's a little bit darker, does one taste sweeter than the other?
Oh, they're just very slight different flavours. This one has a little bit more of a floral burst to it, with perhaps we might have some of the Goya just starting to flower and influencing this flavour. This one here is pretty much the privet honey, I think, and look at that. That is a perfect jar of honey. And it's got bubbles in it. When those bubbles rise to the top, you'll be able to really see the clarity it has. Yum. I'm going to put that over here so you can really tell the difference between the colours of honey. Look at that. Got a really light one there now. And if you compare that to these dark ones, it's just so different. If I switch these around, you get the contrast between the two. I'll try not to knock the jars off. I wanted to put them up here so you could really see the light come through them. Look at that. Such a difference. Winter, spring.
Fantastic. Seeds, what about when the bees are collecting the nectar? Can they mix up the flowers, and does that create a different taste in the honey as well?
Certainly, sometimes you'll see streaks of colour coming through straight out of the hive. So the bees, you can't guarantee they're going to stay on one flower, and they often don't. They will be mixing. So when people say that is an ironbark honey, beekeepers mean mostly ironbark, because some of the bees will be foraging on the understory or different things at that time. So beekeepers will put their hives on a good flow and they'll call it that honey, but it usually is a little bit mixed unless you have a real monofloral source. Like, let's say you took your bees out to the canola or rapeseed and left your bees there, then it's probably the only thing they're going to collect, so you can say that's all rapeseed. But here we've got such a variety, which is fantastic for the bees because they need all the different varieties of pollen to keep them healthy, just as we need different protein sources. Pollen that they ferment into bee bread is their protein source, and they need a variety in order to be happy and healthy. So having a good variety is good. In fact, beekeepers that take their bees to a monofloral source will have to move them, or the bees will become sick if they don't have enough variety. Okay, look at that. We've got another jar of honey. Isn't this just gorgeous? Yum. So good. So I can take that out now. And all you need to do is pop this cap back in and you are done harvesting. The bees are already ripping off the capping, you can see here. It gives a thumbs up if you can see those bees just above my finger ripping off the capping and starting to do their work repairing the cells. You can see it over here too. They're getting in there. Those cells are still in open position, they can still get down them a bit. And but when I close those cells off, they'll be able to get fully down there, do their repair work, cover them all in wax, and the whole process starts again with them collecting the nectar, dehydrating it, and making their amazing honey.
So Vicky's wondering what makes their honey candy. What makes the honey go candy in the flow frames?
So different sugar ratios will determine whether it candies earlier or candies later. Or honey, if the moisture content's low, will go candied eventually, but some honeys, depending on whether there's more sucrose, more glucose, or the ratios, will actually, fructose, will actually candy a lot earlier. So for instance, the paperbark down here is a species that produces nectar that does candy quickly. So it doesn't usually candy in the hives because the bees keep the hive warm, but as soon as you harvest it into a jar and take it inside, you can find that will form a cloudy crystalline structure at first and then set into a candy. My kids love the candied honey. They call it the crispy honey. Some people who are used to buying honey from the supermarket, which is heat-treated honey, it won't go candied, and they're used to that being called honey. But of course, if you're from places like New Zealand or colder areas, you're used to having candied honey because honey's candying all the time in those really cold regions. So you hear stories of people throwing away the honey because it went candied, and it's like, well, hang on a minute, that's a perfectly good honey still, it's just changed its form. If you don't want it candied, you can always warm it up by putting that jar of honey in a pot of hot water for a little while and raising the temperature till it cracks, and you'll get liquid honey again. But I recommend just using it as a candied honey because that's a beautiful texture as well.
Right. So is there any maintenance involved? We've got someone who's had their flow frames for a long time, and just wondering, is there maintenance involved in the flow frames to keep them from turning when they're opening and closing the frames?
Yes, if you've got a lot of wax build up and let's say you haven't harvested them for a very long time, the key can get very hard to turn. So what I recommend you do, if that's the case, if some parts of the frame aren't lifting when you're turning the key, is first of all use 2 keys in there, and that will give it a bit more of a lift. If you find there's still an issue, then what you'll need to do is take that frame out and you can leave a key in the bottom position turned, put it in a black tub in the sun, and all those parts should lift. Now, then what you'll need to do, once that honey's drained out, is use a pressure washer to blast away a lot of the old wax, give them a good clean up, and then you can start afresh. And we find after about 5 years, 5 seasons or so, people are starting to think about giving their frames a good clean up with the pressure washer and giving them a new lease of life and start again. Please don't throw them away. Make them last as long as possible. We'd like them to last a very long time and be of great service to you as a beekeeper.
Great, thanks. Now, Jeff, Jeff went away for 4 weeks and they put on a second brood box. They've come home and done an inspection. Half the box, the brood box, is filled with nectar, as well as filling up the super. The queen is in there laying now. Jeff's wondering, should they take off that second brood box? And I guess Jeff is somewhere here in Australia.
Okay, depends whereabouts in the world you are. If you have and it depends on the season, so we need a bit more information there. But generally we find the time for putting on a second brood box or a second super is when they have used all of the frames in the bottom box. So when they've used all of the frames in the bottom box, and so they've drawn all of their wax out to create the hexagon cells in all the frames, then that's the time to put on another box or another super. And whether or not you want to reduce the size of your hive will depend on what season you're in, and local knowledge is always a good go-to for that.
Look, it sounds like Jeff could be near us. He's saying on the north coast. I'm thinking the north coast here, perhaps.
North Coast, New South Wales. So his question is, he's put a...
They went away, they added a second brood box,
Yep.
went away for 4 weeks, and then they came back and half the box was nectar, as well as filling up the super. The queen is in there laying now, so
Yep.
doing well. Just wondering about taking off that second brood box. And it says he's on the north coast.
Okay, some things to consider there. If there's brood in there, obviously you don't want to take the box off because that brood will need somewhere to go. Potentially, if you are wanting to reduce the size of your hive for some reason, there's a bunch of things you need to consider. One is the brood in the top you'll need to find a home for, whether it be in the bottom box or in another hive. And you'll need to do something with the honey frames full of honey. Some beekeepers like to freeze them and give them back to the bees if they need them later. Some beekeepers like to process them in conventional ways or crush and strain them or eat them as honeycomb. And so your choice here is just to leave that second brood box on and then put your flow super on top of that. So you have 2 brood boxes and flow super. If you've got a good nectar flow and a booming hive, then it should get up there and fill it, but it'll take a bit longer than if you're in this configuration. I always recommend starting in this configuration, then adding more boxes later. In the colder regions, it is common to add a second brood box first though, or some beekeepers with flow frames like to add a brood box and then an ideal or a 3/4 size box, and then the flow frames on top of that. So there's all of these options. Local knowledge is key. Being in the northern rivers here, you could go either way. You can reduce the hive to this size, making sure that there is enough room for your bees, because you don't want your hive to swarm. So there needs to be enough space, and it is one tactic, is making the hive bigger to reduce the chances of swarming. Being early spring here, I would probably just let them do their thing and add the second box, the flow frame on top of your second brood box. So the flow super on top of your second brood box, and give them a crack at filling it.
Great. So now Mike's in Colorado. I love how we go from one full-on climate to the other, getting ready for a nice cold winter in Colorado. Just wondering, how do you get the bees out of the flow super after they've harvested to prep those flow frames for winter?
Okay, so getting the bees out of a super, just bear with me.
Yeah.
microphones have fallen off. I might need a little bit more tape if someone's got any. There we go. So getting bees out of a super, whether they're conventional super or flow frames, there's a few options for you, but generally one easy method is you just take the frames out and brush the bees off. Walk away, brush them off again, and put them aside, keep them away from the bees, and that way you've got the bees back close to the hive, they'll fly back to the hive, and the frames you're taking away without the bees on them.
Great, thanks Seeds. Before you were talking about those level cedar, and I had actually a customer the other day on the phone, and they'd followed the levels, but then they were concerned that then the hive was sloping towards the back. And her hubby said, no, you must make it level, you must make it level. So it should slope towards the back, and I think a few people get a little bit confused about that little level.
Yes, so we have put the level on an angle. So when you see, if you go around to this side of the hive here, on the left side, you'll see a level bubble. When that is central, you have the hive on the correct honey harvesting angle of about 3 degrees. And when you have the level bubble in the back central, that is for naturally drawn comb, you've got the level in the sideways direction. So I think I just put gaff tape in my armpit, that's unfortunate, that'll hurt later.
Seeds, what's the shelf life of honey? Oh, this will come your favourite one.
Yeah, it's just incredible stories about honey lasting, and there's even a longer story than the one in the Egyptian tombs, but the Egyptian tombs had honey lasting 3,000 years. Pretty hard to find a food product that'll last so long. So what an incredible thing honey is. And the only way to get it to last that long is to get a really low moisture content, make sure it has a sealed lid. The honey will of course go candied, but it's not off. 3,000 years, apparently the honey was edible when those clay pots were uncovered. So isn't that amazing? The bees are clever at making the honey last because it's their food for later. They need to store it for a long cold winter ahead or a time with no flowers, and they know that if they get the moisture content low enough, cover it in wax so that the moisture doesn't change, it will last a very long time for them. It's the same for us. If we harvest it, put it in a jar and make sure it's sealed, it'll last a very long time for us too.
Great. Now, so tips on if you're wanting to add a flow hive super to a traditional hive, what things do you need to consider?
Okay, so the main thing is the slope of the hive. So conventional hive, and it depends whether it's got a screen bottom board or not. So what we did with the flow hive is a bit unusual. Now this jar is just about to overflow, so we better finish off our little bit of harvesting here. Remembering to put the key in the top, and the top slot is here, and turning it, whoops, in the top and turning it, and leave it there for a minute to make sure all of those cell parts are pushed down in the cell form position. Now we've got another overflower. That's unusual to overflow this would be a 2-point-something litre jar by the time you weigh up at the neck. But look at that, isn't that just gorgeous? The honey flow is on and the bees are building out their cells as far as they can. Yum, yum. You also notice when the honey flow's on, the bees aren't coming around to lick any honey behind the hive because they're too busy going to the flowers. If it was another time of year and the bees were a bit hungry, we'd need to cover the jar up as it harvests, as you see us doing with those wax wraps or kitchen wrap. Mmm. Yum, yum.
Nice. We've got someone saying, have you ever thought about submitting, I think they're talking about the photos, or I'm not sure the invention, to the Earthshot Prize? They think Prince William would be very impressed with our flow hives.
Ah, okay. Thanks for the heads up.
Whatever Earthshot Prize is.
Haven't had that one.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Okay, now this was a good question. Where did I lose it there? Oh, so with the flow hive, when the bees fill the flow frames with the wax and then we take out the honey, does that wax just stay there forever and ever, and do the bees just keep using the same wax to fill up those flow frames?
You know, that was a point of contention in the beginning. A lot of people said, no, the bees will never recycle capping inside the hive, but they clearly do. You can watch them doing it. They will rip off the capping and reuse that to rebuild the cells. So they will recycle a lot of wax, and that's why it gets darker and darker over time, and that's why after about 5 years, 5 seasons or so, it might be getting quite dark on the flow frames, and it can be a good idea to blast off some of that old wax with a pressure washer to give them a fresh start again. So yes, they will recycle the wax and recycle it. All the bees' footprints and also propolis content will make it darker and darker, and that's why you see the frames that are being used a lot in the bottom box, they get darker and darker, and you've also got the silk cocoons of the brood as well. You don't generally have that in the top box unless the queen's squeezed up through the excluder, but nevertheless the wax gets darker and darker after some time. You'll probably see that in another hive here. Let's have a look. It's not too dark, but you can see it's still a lot darker than that one we were just looking at. Getting some brown tones and some dark yellow tones through here.
Nice. How does the Australian honey compare to New Zealand honey?
Okay, so you might be best to answer that question. Trace, being from NZ, what do you think in terms of New Zealand honey versus Australian honey?
Oh, well, it's funny, you know, I think sometimes New Zealand honey can be really strong tasting, and I probably prefer the lighter flavours here in Australia. Obviously we eat a lot of Manuka honey in New Zealand, and creamed honey. I don't know, as kids we always had creamed honey out of waxed pots on toast with covered in butter. It was delicious. So yeah, I like the lighter flavoured honeys myself.
Wow, a bit of contention there, saying she likes the Aussie honey versus New Zealand, but there you go, she's come across.
Oh my God.
But in New Zealand you get these wonderful creamed honeys. So what I like in honey is variety. If someone says, what's your favourite honey? I say I like lots of different varieties of honey, which is part of the reason why we like to have a single frames to single jars, so that you can taste that deep multi flavours of this one and the really bright kind of blow your taste buds off flavours of this lighter one, and then the burnt toffee flavours of this paperbark one, and then some amazing fruity flavour here that who knows where it comes from, but the bees found it. So you just get this beautiful thing of all the different flavours, and if you bring them out on your kitchen table, it just creates wonderful conversation when people come to visit. And when you give people jars of honey, I always like to give them a dark one and a light one, and straight away they go, what's going on here? And it's just a wonderful thing about bees is they'll bring in what is available, and sometimes it's nectar that produces really dark honey, and sometimes it's nectar that produces really light honey like this, and all the flavours to match.
Great. Seeds, and is that the same when you take out the honeycomb? I remember last week we took some out, didn't we, and it was really white, like pale.
So when you say really light white wax, that's the first wax. The wax has not been recycled yet. They've produced it from their wax glands. The younger bees do that, and then the bees have grabbed that wax, softened it up and created their comb structure. So the first time they do it, it's really white, and then it gets darker over time. And we had a combination of very light white first wax and a very light honey too, which was this one coming in, this privet. So yes, honeycomb is the same deal. You'll get dark honeys and light honeys, and it's wonderful to taste the differences as well. If you want to harvest honey with your honeycomb with your flow hive, you can do so down here on the edges of the brood nest, or you can make a honey collection area up in the roof by taking that plug out. I recommend confining them to a smaller area, so it's a bit easier to remove the roof than having a whole lot of comb up there between the inner cover and the gabled roof.
Right. Malcolm's in country Victoria, and just wondering what is the best time to transfer, so a Langstroth, a more traditional hive, to a flow hive?
Best time to do that, which area are they?
Country Victoria.
Uh-huh. So you're in a wonderful time of year to beekeep now. The spring's just kicking in for you. So any time now should be a great time to transfer a conventional Langstroth across to your flow hive. So you've got the whole season ahead of you too, so great timing to get going with your flow hive.
Great. Now, we've got someone asking, does this flow hive make maple syrup?
Sometimes it tastes like it.
Yeah.
Maple syrup is, I had a friend who was a maple farmer in Canada, and he told me all sorts of dramas about harvesting maple syrup with the squirrels eating all the tubes that come from the trees. It's quite fascinating. But it's a process of collecting that sap and then reducing it. Lucky for us, the bees do that work for us. They collect the sweet nectar and they reduce it into a product called honey, and they add their special sauce, their enzymes, and eventually they've got this beautiful product to store. And lucky for us, they often store more than they need, and we can share some too. Some of them do taste a bit like maple syrup, but maple syrup is its own thing in its own right, I think.
Great. Now Lucy's tuning in on that one about the bees waxing the flow frames. I'm wondering, so the first time you go to use the flow hive, will it maybe take longer as the bees have to wax everything up?
There's a possibility. Some bees will go very quickly, some will go slowly. It really depends on the season. So if you've got a lot of bees in your box and a good nectar flow like we have now, these frames were put on about 4 weeks ago, and they've done a great job of waxing them up and filling the frames. This hive here is going a bit slower. They have made a start, and we actually took a split from this, so that would have slowed it down a bit. But you can see that them producing nectar in the center regions here. And so it's colony specific, it's location specific, depending on the nectar availability. So don't expect it to happen instantly. But if you do want to hurry things up, or you're getting impatient, then you can scrape some wax off the top of the brood frames. If your bees are ready for their top box, they're probably building a bit of wax up there. You can scrape it off, press it into the flow frame, do it on the side window, and you can enjoy watching them recycle that wax in that region. Of course, you still won't get any honey stores till there's an abundant nectar flow and lots of bees in your box to go and collect that nectar and bring it back to the hive.
Great. Now, of course, we've got a couple of people saying, whereabouts are we?
We're here on the Northern Rivers, so we're on the east coast of Australia, close to the most easterly point. And it's a subtropical region. In winter we often get a good honey flow. This winter we didn't. We didn't get the rain at the right time. We often get good paperbark flows here during the winter. This year the bees were a little bit hungry in the winter time, but it's come good now and the season has really kicked in, which typically happens halfway through August. So beautiful place to be keeping bees and harvesting amazing honey.
Great. And this could be a good one to end on, seeds. It's come up a couple of times on the phones actually this week, that people sort of understanding that beekeeping is seasonal, I suppose, and so you have good seasons and bad seasons and lots of other factors.
Absolutely. Last year was a bit of a poor spring actually. It didn't flow as good as this is. So depending, you might have floods, you might have droughts, you might have fires. Just like any kind of farming, you have your good seasons and your poor seasons. So what the bees are farming is nectar from flowers. So you need a good healthy colony and you need a lot of flowers producing nectar. When those things coincide, you get an amazing amount of honey. A hive like this could actually visit 50 million flowers in a day, which is absolutely incredible for pollination, but also it's just incredible to make this amazing stuff we call honey. We're in a honey month. in the Northern Hemisphere, but it feels like honey month here in Australia too, with all of this honey coming in. They've drawn out the comb so far. This jar is completely filled up and I cannot even close the lid without spilling the honey. So I'm going to have to take that one back to the kitchen. Thanks for watching. If you want an online training course, have a look at thebeekeeper.org. We've put a lot of effort into training material to take you from square one right through to even a deep scientific knowledge. And we're here each week to ask questions live as well, and don't hesitate to contact our customer support team as well. We've got a dedicated hive here of worker bees to help you to get going with your flow hive. And we do have a special at the moment if you do need an excuse to jump in and get another hive or start in beekeeping. Thanks for watching. Let us know what you'd like us to cover next week, and we'll be back with another show and tell. And I love this time of year because of all of the beautiful honeys we can harvest. And if you look after your bees, then you get this amazing reward of all of these beautiful honeys you can take back to the kitchen.